Sicilian Baroque is the distinctive form of Baroque architecture which evolved on the island of Sicily off the southern coast of Italy. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the style is recognizable not only by its typical Baroque curves and flourishes, but also by its grinning masks and putti and a particular flamboyance that has given Sicily a unique architectural identity. The Sicilian Baroque style came to fruition during a major surge of rebuilding following the massive earthquake in 1693. Previously, the Baroque style had been used on the island in a naïve and parochial manner, having evolved from hybrid native architecture rather than being derived from the great Baroque architects of Rome. After the earthquake, local architects, many of them trained in Rome, were given plentiful opportunities to recreate the more sophisticated Baroque architecture that had become popular in mainland Italy. The work of these local architects, and the new genre of architectural engravings that they pioneered, inspired more local architects to follow the lead. Around 1730, Sicilian architects had developed a confidence in the use of the Baroque style. The particular interpretation led to further evolution to a personalized and highly localized art form on the island. For the 1780s onwards, the style was gradually replaced by the newly fashionable neoclassicism. The highly decorative Sicilian Baroque period lasted barely 50 years and perfectly reflected the social order of the island at a time when, nominally ruled by Spain, it was in fact governed by a wealthy and often extravagant aristocracy into whose hands ownership of the primarily agricultural economy was highly concentrated. Its Baroque architecture gives the island an architectural character that has lasted into the 21st century. Characteristics: Baroque architecture is a European phenomenon originating in 17th century Italy. It is flamboyant and theatrical, and richly ornamented by sculpture and an effect known as chiaroscuro, the strategic use of light and shade on a building created by mass and shadow. The Baroque style in Sicily was largely confined to buildings erected by the church, and palazzi built as private residences for the Sicilian aristocracy. The earliest examples of this style in Sicily lacked individuality and were typically heavy-handed pastiches of buildings seen by Sicilian visitors to Rome, Florence, and Naples. However, even at this early stage, provincial architects had begun to incorporate certain vernacular features of Sicily's older architecture. By the middle of the 18th century, when Sicily's Baroque architecture was noticeably different from that of the mainland, it typically included at least 2 or 3 of the following features, coupled with a unique freedom of design that is more difficult to characterize in words. Grotesque masks and putti, often supporting balconies or decorating various bands of the entablature of a building. These grinning or glaring faces are a relic of Sicilian architecture from before the mid-17th century. Balconies, often complemented by intricate wrought-iron balustrades after 1633, and by planar balustrades before that date. External staircases. Most villas and palazzi were designed for formal entrance by carriage through an archway in the street facade, leading to a courtyard within. An intricate double staircase would lead from the courtyard to the piano nobile. This would be the palazzo's principal entrance to the first-floor reception rooms. The symmetrical flights of steps would turn inwards and outwards, as many as 4 times. Owing to the topography of their elevated sites, it was often necessary to approach churches by many steps. These steps were often transformed into long straight marble staircases, in themselves decorative architectural features, in the manner of the Spanish steps in Rome. Canted, concave, or convex facades. Occasionally in a villa or palazzo, an external staircase would be fitted into the recess created by the curve. The Sicilian belfry. Belfries were not placed beside the church in a campanile tower as is common in Italy, but on the façade itself, often surmounting the central pediment, with one or more bells clearly displayed beneath its own arch, such as at Catania's Collegiata. In a large church with many bells, this usually resulted in an intricately sculpted and decorated arcade at the highest point of the principal façade. These belfries are among the most enduring and characteristic features of Sicilian Baroque architecture. Inlaid colored marble set into both floor and walls, especially in church interiors. This particular form of intarsia developed in Sicily from the 17th century. Columns that are often deployed singularly, supporting plain arches and thus displaying the influence of the earlier and much plainer Norman period. Columns are rarely encountered, as elsewhere in Europe, in clustered groups acting as piers, especially in examples of early Sicilian Baroque. Decorated rustication. Sebastiano Serlio had decorated the blocks of ashlar in his rustication by the end of the 16th century. Sicilian architects were ornamenting the blocks with carvings of leaves, fish scales, and even sweets and shells. Shells were later to become among the most prevalent ornamental symbols of Baroque design. Sometimes the rustication would be used for pillars rather than walls, a reversal of expectations and almost an architectural joke. The local volcanic lava stone that was used in the construction of many Sicilian Baroque buildings, because this was the most readily available. Many sculptors and stone cutters of the period lived at the foot of Mount Etna, making the diversity of objects, including balustrades, pillars, fountains and seats for buildings. Shades of black or gray were used to create contrasting decorative effects, accentuating the Baroque love of light and shade as demonstrated in the Spanish influence. The architectural influence of the ruling Spanish, although this was a milder influence than that of the Normans. The Spanish style, a more restrained version of French Renaissance architecture, is particularly evident in eastern Sicily, where, owing to minor insurrections, the Spanish maintained a stronger military presence. Messina's monumental Porta Grazia, erected in 1680 as the entrance to a Spanish citadel, would not be out of place in any of the towns and citadels built by the Spanish in the colonies elsewhere. The style of this arched city gate, with its ornate mouldings and scrolls, was widely copied all over Catania immediately following the quay. While these characteristics never occur altogether in the same building, and none are unique to Sicilian Baroque, it is the coupling together which gives the Sicilian Baroque its distinctive air. Other Baroque characteristics, such as broken pediments over windows, the extravagant use of statuary, and curved-topped windows and doors are all emblematic of Baroque architecture, but can all be found on Baroque building all over Europe. Early Sicilian Baroque. Volcanic Sicily in the central Mediterranean off the Italian peninsula has been colonized by the Greeks, then it was under the Romans, the Byzantines, the Ostrogoths, the Muslims, the Normans, the Hohenstaufen, the Angevins and the Aragonese, after whom it became a province of the Spanish Empire and then was part of the Bourbon Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, before finally being absorbed into the Kingdom of Italy in 1860. Thus, Sicilians have been exposed to a rich sequence of disparate cultures. This is reflected in the extraordinary diversity of architecture on the island. A form of decorated classical architecture peculiar to Sicily had begun to evolve from the 1530s, inspired by the ruined Greek architecture and by the Norman cathedrals on the island. This often incorporated Greek architectural motifs such as the Greek key pattern into late Norman architecture with Gothic features such as pointed arches and window apertures. The Sicilian Norman architecture incorporated some Byzantine elements seldom found in Norman architecture elsewhere. Unlike other Romanesque architecture, it went on to incorporate Gothic features. This early ornate architecture differs from that of mainland Europe in not having evolved from Renaissance architecture. Instead, it was developed from Norman styles. Renaissance architecture hardly touched Sicily. In the capital city of Palermo, the only remnant of the High Renaissance is the Fontana Pretoria, a water fountain originally made for Don Pietro di Toledo by Florentine artists Francesco Camilliani and Michelangelo Naxarino, and brought to Sicily when it was already 20 years old. Whatever the reason that Renaissance style never became popular in Sicily, it was certainly not ignorance. Antonello Gagini was midway through constructing the church of Santa Maria di Porto Salvo in 1536 in the Renaissance style when he died. He was superseded by the architect Antonio Scaglione, who completed the building in a Norman style. This style seems to have influenced Sicilian architecture almost up to the time of the 1693 earthquake. Even mannerism passed the island by. Only in the architecture of Messina could a Renaissance influence be discerned, partly for geographical reasons. Within sight of mainland Italy and the most important port in Sicily, Messina was always more amenable to the prevailing tides of fashion outside the island. The town's aristocratic patrons would often call on Florence or Rome to provide them with an architect. One example was the Florentine Giovanni Angelo Montorsoli, who established the Tuscan styles of architecture and sculpture there in the mid-16th century. However, these influences remained largely confined to Messina and the surrounding district. It seems likely that it was the patronage of the Roman Catholic Church, removed from the influences of Roman fashion, that remained conservative in architectural taste. This is not to say that Sicily was completely isolated from trends elsewhere in Europe. Architecture in the island's major cities was strongly influenced by the family of the sculptor Domenico Gagini, who arrived from Florence in 1463. This family of sculptors and painters decorated churches and buildings with ornate decorative and figurative sculpture. Less than a century after his family had begun to cautiously decorate the island's churches, Antonio Gagini completed the proscenium-like arch of the Cappella della Madonna in the Santuario dell'Annunziata at Trapani. This pedamented arch of the sanctuary has pilasters, not fluted, but decorated heavily with relief busts of the saints, and, most importantly in terms of architecture, the pediment is adorned by reclining saints supporting swags linked to the central shield that crowns the pediment. This ornate pediment, although still unbroken, was one of the first signs that Sicily was forming its own style of decorative architecture. Similar in style is the Chiesa del Gesù, constructed between 1564 and 1633, which also shows early signs of the Sicilian Baroque. Thus, a particular brand of Baroque architecture had begun to evolve in Sicily long before the earthquake of 1693. While the majority of those buildings that can be clearly classified as Baroque in style date from around 1650, the scarcity of these isolated, surviving examples of Sicily's 17th-century architectural history makes it hard to fully and accurately evaluate the architecture immediately before the natural disaster. The earthquake destroyed not only most of the buildings, but also most of their documentation. Yet more information has been lost in subsequent earthquakes and severe bombing during World War II. The earliest example of Baroque on the island is Giulio Lassu's Quattro Canti, an octagonal piazza, or circus, constructed around 1610 at the crossroads of the city's two principal streets. Around this intersection of four open sides being the streets, and for matching buildings with identical canted corners. The sides of the four buildings are curved, further heightening the Baroque design of the buildings lining the circus. These four great buildings dominating the circus are each enhanced by a fountain reminiscent of those of Pope Sixtus V's Quattro Fontane in Rome. However, here in Palermo the Baroque theme continues up 3 stories of the buildings, which are adorned with statues in recessed niches depicting the 4 seasons, the 4 Spanish kings of Sicily, and the 4 patronesses of Palermo, Saints Christina, Ninfa, Olivia, and Agata, while each facade of Quattro Canti is pleasing to the eye. As of scheme it is both out of proportion with the limited size of the piazza and, like most other examples of early Sicilian Baroque, can be considered provincial, naive and heavy-handed, compared with later developments. Whatever its merit, it is evident that during the 17th century, the Baroque style in the hands of the local architects and sculptors was already deviating from that of mainland Italy. This localized variation on the mainstream Baroque was not peculiar to Sicily, but occurred as far afield as Bavaria and Russia, where Naïve Baroque would be just as eccentric as its Sicilian cousin.